The ID card hit the marble floor with a dry, sharp, icy snap that seemed to freeze the entire lobby of Northwood Financial. No one could believe that Evan Turner, the 38-year-old branch manager, had just tossed a 62-year-old man's identification to the ground as carelessly as flicking away trash. Yet that small, cruel moment ignited a chain of events that would shake Seattle's financial world. Harold Bennett stood still inside the circle of curious, judging eyes belonging to the customers waiting for their transactions. He bent down and slowly picked up the ID card, his calloused hand steady even as his heart tightened with a familiar ache, the kind of pain that a lifetime of hard work and perseverance still couldn't erase the pain of being judged by appearance alone. Evan folded his arms, straightened his tie, and stood with the smug posture of someone convinced he had just done the right thing. "I'm sorry, but documents like this don't inspire confidence," he said, his voice flat yet cutting. "Perhaps you should look for a bank that better matches your profile." Each word landed like a needle. Harold lifted his gaze, and beneath the haze of years etched into his eyes, a strange calm flickered. It wasn't the calm of weakness. It was the calm of someone who understood human nature far better than anyone else in the room. The calm of a man who had survived storms and risen after countless moments of being underestimated. An older woman in the waiting area whispered to her husband, her sympathetic glance drifting toward Harold. Two tellers paused their work, pretending to stay focused while failing to hide their discomfort. The air in the lobby felt suffocated, the hum of the air conditioner slicing through the heavy silence. "I understand," Harold replied, his voice low but steady, like an underground current flowing beneath stone. "I only intended to make a simple transaction. But perhaps, as you said today, is not the right time." Evan rolled his eyes and turned to his assistant Paula, who stood nearby, with cheeks flushed from embarrassment. "Happens all the time," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "People walk in here and think they deserve VIP service. People." That single word cut into Harold's ears like a blade. Still he didn't react, didn't frown, didn't argue. His silence unsettled Evan for a fleeting second, a second he quickly brushed aside in arrogance. Evan had no idea that the man standing before him was far from ordinary, that behind the modest exterior was a history. He could not imagine that Harold was not merely a customer. He was a test Evan had already failed from the first moment. Harold straightened, smoothed the ID card, and his aged eyes glowed with a soft light that wasn't gentle but observant, the light of someone who had witnessed far more than Evan ever had. His every movement was slow, yet unwavering. Even as he turned to leave, Harold radiated a quiet strength that made a few customers tilt their heads, sensing something that didn't quite fit. Something that hinted the older man wasn't the poor old guy Evan assumed, as if they had just witnessed something that would not end here. Evan moved on to assist a white female customer who had stepped forward. He bowed, slightly smiled wide, and his tone transformed, suddenly soft as velvet and sweet as honey. The contrast hung in the air like a slap. Harold stopped near the revolving doors. He pulled out his phone, his fingers slow but intentional. A short message was sent, carrying no anger and no trembling, only a weight that Northwood Financial would remember. "Claire, I need to talk to you about Northwood Financial urgent." The reply came instantly. "What happened, Dad? I'm reviewing the final contract with them." Harold stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped the phone into his pocket. A faint smile crossed his lips, a smile subtle enough to make an attentive person shiver. His calm did not belong to someone defeated. It belonged to someone who had just seen exactly what he needed to see. As Harold stepped through the glass doors, the midday Seattle sunlight washed over him, highlighting the lines carved into his face, by time but never diminishing him. Each step he took was light, yet firm, as if what had happened inside the bank was merely one piece of a larger plan, a plan only he understood. And if Evan Turner could have heard the final thought drifting through Harold's mind as he left, he might not have stood so confidently behind that counter. Some mistakes cost more than careers, they cost futures. Harold walked away without anger, without sorrow, only carrying the stillness of a storm gathering strength. And no one in Northwood Financial that day knew that the ID card tossed to the floor was not a sign of insignificance, but the tolling bell for a complacent financial empire. That evening, as the Seattle sky deepened into a stormy blue and looked ready to break into rain, the warm yellow light in Claire Bennett's living room cast a tense yet composed glow across the face of the 39-year-old woman standing against the kitchen counter, her hand tightening around the phone that had just delivered a message from her father. What chilled her wasn't the short line of text, it was the fact that Harold almost never used the word urgent. The man who had taught her how to stay calm in any storm, how to think before speaking, how to stand tall even when being underestimated, had just told her something was wrong with the bank she was partnering with to finalize a $5 billion deal. And that had never been a good sign. When Harold stepped into the house, his silver hair slightly tousled by the wind, Claire immediately sensed he was holding something back, not because he wanted to spare her worry, but because he was weighing just how devastating the consequences of his words might be. Claire invited him to sit, poured him a cup of hot tea, yet she herself couldn't stay still. That what happened at Northwood. Her voice was small but pulled taut, like a string stretched to its final limit. Harold set the cup down, his hands, the same hands that had built a business from nothing interlocking in front of him, a habit he only fell into when preparing to reveal a truth that would be hard to accept. He explained slowly, detail by detail, from the moment he walked into the bank to the moment his ID was thrown onto the marble floor. He described the disdain in Evan Turner's eyes, the mocking tone, the way he said, "People like you," in front of the entire lobby. It had only taken a few minutes, yet each sentence scraped raw against Claire's chest. Her hand clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. There was no resentment in Harold's voice, but that very calmness made Claire even angrier, so angry her chest felt crushed. Not because her father had been insulted, but because the one who had humiliated him was the very senior manager Northwood planned to put in charge of executing the partnership with her company, the deal both sides were calling a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the deal that would push Northwood into a new league of power in the financial world. Evan Turner. Claire repeated the name, as if carving it into stone. She had seen that name on the list of personnel the bank had provided. 38 years old, highly rated for decisiveness, lead strategist for multiple corporate optimization initiatives. Only now did Claire realize something she had never considered, that his achievements may have been built on the very quiet discrimination he believed was a professional instinct. Harold watched his daughter pace the room like a restrained predator, fighting natural impulse. "I'm fine," Claire Harold said softly, almost in a whisper. But the words didn't soothe her. They only revealed the real wound that her father had grown used to moments of being underestimated, used to the kind of insult that no longer made him angry. And that was exactly what she could not forgive. You know, Dad, Claire stopped, her eyes red, but her voice cold and sharp. Tomorrow I will meet them, and I want to hear from their own mouths how they treat their customers. Harold shook his head gently. You don't need to jeopardize the company because of me. Claire turned, her eyes blazing. I'm not doing this because of you. I'm doing it because it's right. Northwood wants us to believe they are serious, professional, trustworthy. But if one of their managers is willing to insult a customer because of appearance, this isn't a personal flaw. It's culture. Harold looked at his daughter for a long moment, pride and worry blurring together in his gaze until it felt almost heavy. He knew Claire never acted impulsively. She was like him, but sharper, fiercer, and with far more power behind her choices. And that meant tomorrow would not be simple. Claire moved to the file cabinet, pulled open a private drawer only she used. She retrieved a thick folder, the cultural assessment dossier her legal team had compiled over 3 months to prepare for the partnership. She spread the pages across the table, her eyes slicing through each line like a blade. Dad, do you remember what Evan said? Claire asked. You should find a bank that matches your profile better. Harold nodded, the faintest smile on his lips, making Claire's fist tighten further. Do you have his profile? Harold asked, his voice solid as stone. Claire handed him her tablet. Harold scrolled slowly through Evan's posts on LinkedIn, subtle status updates about maintaining customer standards, comments hinting that misaligned clients create image risk likes on posts containing thinly veiled discrimination. With every post he read, Claire's jaw grew tighter. I saved everything before leaving the bank, Harold said. Not for revenge, for preparation, because I thought these things might matter to you. And that was the moment Claire understood why Harold had smiled on his way out of the bank. He knew this would not end as a personal insult. He knew his daughter, the CEO of Bennett Innovations, a woman with a will forged stronger than steel, would never let this pass. Claire picked up her phone, standing straight as though her entire body had been sculpted from resolve. Tomorrow, she said each word, slicing through the air, Northwood will learn they have made the most expensive mistake of their lives. Harold closed his eyes briefly and exhaled slowly. When he opened them again, the hurt was gone, replaced by the strength of someone preparing to stand in the center of a storm and remain immovable. Because he knew that once Claire decided on a course of action, nothing and no one could stop her. And the quiet wind beginning to stir inside that small room would soon become the storm that swept an arrogant bank from its pedestal of power. In the upscale restaurant on the 25th floor of the Glass Tower in downtown Seattle, Evan Turner leaned back in his leather chair, speared a piece of expensive pan-seared salmon, and laughed loudly as he retold his morning triumph to his 3 colleagues. The midday sunlight poured through the wide windows, making his deep blue suit gleam with confidence, while the clinking of silverware chimed like a soundtrack to the arrogance rising in every breath he took. You guys should have seen his face when I tossed the ID, Evan said, reenacting the dramatic throwing motion, startling a nearby waitress who turned in alarm. The type who thinks walking into a bank automatically earns them VIP treatment. Please, do they even know this is Northwood Financial? We don't open our doors for just anyone. The table erupted in laughter, though it was the hollow kind, louder than it was sincere. Rick, sitting beside him, swallowed hard before letting out a forced laugh and patting Evan on the shoulder. You really have an eye for people. I would have frozen if it were me." Evan only grew more pleased with himself. He spread his arms, lounging deeper into his chair, his grin curling with pride. "I have worked here for 8 years, long enough to know exactly who's a valuable client and who is trash looking to leech off the bank." The word trash shot out of Evan's mouth like an invisible blow to the air, making Paula, the assistant, who had witnessed everything that morning, stiffen slightly. She tried to focus on her salad, but each bite seemed to lodge in her throat whenever she thought of the calm gaze of that older man. Evan Paula said quietly, "Maybe he really did need to open a business account. We didn't check anything." Evan waved his hand sharply, as if swatting away a fly. "Paula, don't be naive. A man who looks like that, involved in a business account. Please, women's judgment can be limited." Rick burst out laughing, while Paula lowered her eyes in silence. Something heavy pressed in her chest. Not anger, but a gut feeling that what happened that morning was far from simple. Evan kept talking louder and sharper, as if deliberately trying to let the nearby tables hear him. "You know, I almost told him to go find a charity and beg for money. Honestly, that might have suited him better." 2 men at the table laughed, but Paula couldn't swallow a single bite more. At that moment, the restaurant door opened, and a cold draft from the hallway fluttered the tablecloth. A brief whisper of silence settled over the room, subtle yet enough to make Evan turn his head instinctively. He didn't know that the wind carried the first signs of a change, the kind of change that would wipe the smugness off his face within mere hours. Evan lifted his wine glass, inhaled lightly, then added fuel to the fire of his ego. "Let me tell you something. Clients like that only drag the bank's reputation down. I'm the one keeping Northwood standards high." Paula glanced sideways at him, and in that instant, she realized she was sitting next to a man who believed the tiny sliver of authority he held was enough to determine someone's worth. In Evan's eyes, the world was divided into 2 types of people, those worthy of respect and those worthy of being stepped on, and he believed he had the right to draw that line. Evan had no idea that while he was lifting his glass across the city in the offices of Bennett Innovations, Claire Bennett was spreading contracts worth $5 billion across the conference table, sitting with her father and 4 senior attorneys as they reviewed every clause related to ethical conduct and partnership standards. Those dry printed lines, termination of partnership in cases of discriminatory behavior, were becoming the sharpest blade Claire was preparing to wield. She wasn't someone who swung a sword out of emotion, but when the reason involved humiliation toward the man who had raised her logic and emotion, merged into a force no one could stop. "How long has he been doing this?" Claire asked, while going through Evan's personnel file that she had just requested. One attorney replied, "According to internal reports, there have been a few informal complaints, mostly regarding subtle discriminatory conduct. Not enough evidence for disciplinary action." Harold nodded slightly, his expression not angry, but profoundly knowing. "The problem isn't what he did to me," he said, his voice as steady as a winter lake. "The problem is that he's been doing it to many others, people who have no way to fight back." Claire closed her eyes for a single second, the only moment she allowed herself softness, then opened them with a gaze sharp as a blade. "Tomorrow we meet them, and Evan Turner will have to face the truth." Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Evan kept swirling his wine glass, unaware that every word he uttered was digging a deeper grave for his own career. He laughed, flashing his polished white teeth, and declared triumphantly, "They need me to keep Northwood clean." Paula looked at him, and for the first time during the entire lunch, she spoke with a soft but cutting tone. "Are you sure, Evan? Are you sure they need you? Or are you the one tearing down what others have built?" Evan laughed loudly, brushing off her words the way he brushed off a speck of dust. "What could I possibly tear down? I'm the one bringing this bank the biggest deal of the year. Tomorrow's meeting is just the final step. I guarantee I'll be mentioned in that room." He was right, he would be mentioned, but not in the way he believed. And if Evan could have seen Claire's face at that moment, calm yet cold enough to burn through anything in its path, he would not have wanted to laugh. But he didn't know. And that blindness was carrying him straight toward the moment when the laughter echoing through this restaurant would become desperate pleading in the conference room the next day. Evan Turner was far too confident to realize that fate had already begun its countdown. That night, Seattle wrapped itself in a thin layer of mist like a curtain, lowering just before the main stage lights ignite. In the conference room on the 46th floor of Bennett Innovations, cold white recessed lighting poured down onto the long walnut table that stretched out like a runway, preparing for a jet named $5 billion to either take flight or crash, all depending on the decisions of a handful of people. Claire Bennett stood at the head of the table, tapping a pencil lightly against the polished wood, the rhythm steady but sharp enough that every tap felt like it struck directly into the nerves of everyone present. Meanwhile, Harold Bennett, the 62-year-old man who had been humiliated that very morning, sat quietly at the far corner, his eyes deep as an ancient well reflecting the lights above, but imbued with an eerie calm, as if he were observing the future rather than the strategy on the table. On the large screen was Northwood Financial's profile, a 70-year-old financial institution with an expansive network across the West Coast, and the strategic partnership project that symbolized Bennett Innovations' leap into the international payments market. Everything looked perfect, except for one detail: Evan Turner. And sometimes one wrong person could make an entire corporation collapse like a tower of cards. We need to review Clause 19 regarding partner ethics. Claire said, her voice so cold, the already silent room seemed to lose the last trace of air. Chief Legal Counsel Mark Dalton immediately opened the document, scanning lines that were usually dry, but now sliced through Northwood's future like a sharpened blade. In the event of discriminatory behavior or insult toward corporate clients, Party A reserves the right to unilaterally terminate the partnership without compensation. Claire lifted her chin. Clear enough. Mark adjusted his black-framed glasses and nodded. The issue is we need evidence of systemic discriminatory conduct, not just a single incident. Harold placed his hands on the table, lacing his fingers together, the overhead lights illuminating skin weathered by decades of work, but still radiating strength. He spoke gently. I have prepared. Every gaze snapped toward him, as if drawn by a magnetic pull. Claire turned to him, her eyes flickering for a fraction of a second, before returning to their familiar sharpness. Harold pulled out his old tablet, something simple on the outside, but loaded with ammunition for the battle ahead. I don't use social media much, he said, but I observe the people who do. His calloused fingers slid across the screen. LinkedIn posts appeared, each one a clean slice, exposing Evan Turner's true nature. Posts he shared about maintaining customer standards aligned with the bank's image. Comments implying that certain customer groups create cultural risk. Likes under articles with thinly veiled discriminatory tones. All public, all evidence. Mark froze for a moment, eyes widening. My God, this is an entire behavioral pattern, not accidental, not isolated. This is ingrained belief. Claire frowned, tapping her pencil harder, her gaze cutting into the screen like a blade. And someone who thinks this way is in a branch management role? Then what does that say about Northwood's culture? The question hung in the air like an executioner's axe. Harold looked at his daughter with pride, mixed with an old wound. He knew her better than anyone. Claire never struck from emotion. If she acted, it meant she saw a problem far beyond herself. Claire walked to the electronic board and wrote in bold letters, "Evan Turner equals systemic issue." Then she added, "Terminate partnership, consider." Chief Financial Officer Marcus Hale spoke up. "Claire, I support investigating and clarifying everything. But we also have to consider the financial impact. This partnership could increase next year's revenue by 30%. If we cancel, shareholders will raise major concerns." Claire turned toward him, her eyes straight and piercing. "I would rather lose 30% revenue than build our future on a discriminatory foundation." Marcus inhaled sharply. He was accustomed to Claire's decisive leadership, but this statement sent a chill through him. Harold placed his hands on the table and looked at Marcus and the legal team. "You are right about the money, but integrity is also money. And if you think this company can only succeed with Northwood's help, then you are underestimating my daughter." Claire felt her throat sting for a moment, but she kept her voice level. "Dad." Harold shook his head, his eyes filled with pride and old scars. "You changed the entire payment technology sector. You built this company from 12 people to 4,000. If you could do that, you can survive without Northwood." The room fell into a reverent silence, not heavy, but like a moment of tribute to the decision forming in Claire's mind, a decision destined to become historic between the two companies. Claire switched to another document. "If we cancel, Riverstone National will accept immediately. They have contacted us 3 times. Their terms are better." Marcus nodded quickly. "Yes, they offer lower interest rates and guarantee twice the implementation speed. The only reason we picked Northwood is because they approached us first." Claire curled her lips into a smile devoid of warmth. "Then they should behave like someone who wants a partnership." Harold crossed his arms, his gaze drifting as if recalling the morning scene. "Evan behaved as if he owned the bank." Claire replied, "Tomorrow he will learn he owns nothing except his own mistakes." Mark stood up, eyes steady and resolute. "So shall we proceed?" Claire took a deep breath, then nodded slowly but firmly, like a commander pressing the button that launches a full-scale offensive. "Tomorrow at the 10 o'clock strategy meeting, Northwood Financial will hear everything, from beginning to end." Harold looked at his daughter. Their eyes met in silence, a silence that required no words, only mutual conviction. And right then, in that room, a storm was officially signed into existence. Claire Bennett was its center. And tomorrow morning, Northwood would face the full blaze. That morning, while the Seattle sunlight was still hiding behind thin streaks of cloud, Evan Turner walked into the Northwood Financial branch with footsteps light as a glide, his polished leather shoes tapping against the stone floor like a drum announcing victory before the moment arrived. He wore his best charcoal gray suit, a wine-colored silk tie, and his hair was styled with just enough gel to look sharp, yet effortlessly natural. Today, he was certain the leadership team would call him into the strategic meeting to praise him, perhaps even hint at a promotion. "Paula, make me a special coffee. I want to be in perfect shape before the meeting with Bennett Innovations," Evan said, without looking at his assistant, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed the world existed to serve him. But Paula, after yesterday's lunch, no longer looked at Evan with admiration. Instead, her eyes carried something else, something like a quiet worry, an instinct or that something enormous was coming, and Evan had no idea. At exactly 9:45, Evan adjusted his tie one last time in front of the mirror, smoothing the shoulders of his jacket and smiling at himself, the smile of a man convinced the universe revolved around his arrogance. 9:47. Paula's hurried footsteps echoed outside the office door. Evan, her voice was small and trembling. Something happened. Evan turned with a displeased frown. "What could possibly make you look like you are about to cry?" Paula swallowed hard. "Bennett Innovations, they have arrived. And the man from yesterday, he is with the CEO." Something cold shot down Evan's spine, like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over his neck. He shot to his feet. What that old man with the CEO, Paula, nodded helplessly. "Here is Claire Bennett's father." Evan's whole body froze. In that instant, his heartbeat pounded so loudly he thought he could hear it in his skull. Every sound around him vanished. Only 2 words remained: Father, CEO. He lunged toward his computer, opened a browser, and frantically typed, "Harold Bennett, Seattle entrepreneur," like a desperate man searching for oxygen. The results made him feel his knees weaken. Harold Bennett, former business owner investor, net worth estimated between 40 and 60 million, father of Claire Bennett, CEO of Bennett Innovations. No, this cannot be. Evan whispered like a man reading his own death sentence. He remembered every word he had said the day before. "A man like you trash this bank, does not open its doors for just anyone." Those words now echoed in his mind like shovels striking the grave he had dug for himself. At exactly 9:55, his regional manager called. "Evan, get to the main conference room on the 2nd floor. The meeting has shifted direction. They are requesting your presence." Evan wanted to refuse. He wanted to run, but the words lodged in his throat, because he knew it was time to pay. The 2nd floor conference room blazed with bright white lights, the air thick with tension, stretched tight as a thread ready to snap. Claire Bennett sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her black suit immaculate, her face calm, yet her eyes sharpened like forged steel. Beside her sat Harold, still in the same old coat, still carrying that unnerving stillness. But this time he was not standing alone. Across from them sat Northwood's leadership, the regional director, the financial supervisor, the head of corporate clients, all sitting upright, trying to maintain authority, but paling in comparison to Claire's presence. When Evan stepped in, the entire room turned, and Claire's eyes cut straight through him like a blade of ice. Evan could not change his footsteps, but with each step forward, he felt himself sinking deeper into a swamp. He sat, fingers interlocked tightly to hide his trembling. Claire did not speak immediately. She opened her briefcase, pulled out the $5 billion contract, and placed it on the table, gently. Yet the sound of it hitting the surface cracked through the room like thunder. Today Claire began her voice, low and resonant like a cello. "I did not come here to finalize our partnership. I came to determine whether Northwood deserves a place in my company's strategic future." The regional director stiffened. "Ms. Bennett, I don't understand." Claire cut him off. "And this," she tilted her head toward Harold, "is the man your employee treated like garbage." Harold said nothing. He only looked at Evan with a calmness so cold it stripped him bare. Evan felt exposed, as if every layer of his skin were being peeled back beneath that gaze. Claire placed another stack of papers on the table printouts of Evan's LinkedIn posts, his comments laced with discriminatory undertones, his likes on public articles promoting the idea of filtering clients based on cultural standards. This was not impulsive behavior, Claire said. This is a pattern. Every eye in the room shifted toward Evan, as though he were a stain suddenly revealed under harsh light. The regional director stared at him, stunned. "Good heavens, Turner, what on earth have you done?" Evan opened his mouth, but his throat felt like sand. I thought Claire placed her pen on the table, and her eyes sharpened, until Evan felt as if every word she would say next would split him open. "You did not think, Evan. You judged. You insulted. You abused your position to demean another human being based solely on appearance. And yesterday the person you chose was my father." A suffocating silence fell across the room. Evan opened his mouth again, searching for a shred of authority he once believed he had. I didn't know who he was." And that Claire replied, her voice dropping to a terrifying calm, is the problem. You did not need to know who he was. You only needed to know he was a human being. Yet you acted as if you had the right to decide the worth of a person. Evan collapsed back into his seat, his entire body drained. He knew what was coming. Claire rose, turning her gaze toward Northwood's leadership with icy precision. "My company is officially terminating the partnership. We will move to Riverstone National, a partner who understands how to respect clients from the very first smile." Her words detonated through the room like fireworks, and as Evan brought a trembling hand to his face, he understood it wasn't just the $5 billion deal that had collapsed. His career had fallen with it. Claire turned away, and Harold rose slowly to follow his daughter. As they left the conference room, only one sound echoed inside Evan's mind, the sound of the ID card hitting the marble floor, the sound that had buried him. News of Bennett Innovations cancelling the $5 billion contract with Northwood Financial spread so quickly that even the employees inside the building could not keep up with what was happening. Staff from upper floors rushed toward the hallway outside the conference room, their faces filled with confusion, their tangled whispers buzzing like a swarm of disturbed bees. Did they really cancel? My God, that was $5 billion. What happened to Turner? Evan Turner, the man who had just sat across from Claire Bennett and listened as she pronounced the death sentence on his career, with a voice as calm as ice, was still glued to his chair, as if standing up would make his legs collapse beneath him. Every cell in his body felt as though someone had scooped them out and crushed them. He looked around the now empty conference room, the cold white lights illuminating documents scattered across the table like the broken pieces of his life. A side chair lay tilted, a briefcase, thrown open pens scattered across the floor. Everything mimicking the downfall that had happened in just a few short minutes. His head throbbed, and every sound seemed to echo from miles away. The name Claire Bennett repeated in his mind like a funeral bell. God, Evan buried his face in his hands, his breath ragged. His throat tightened as if someone were squeezing it shut. He had once believed he was the most important person in the branch, the guardian of Northwood's standards, the only one bold enough to push away unworthy customers. But now he was nothing more than a disposable pawn tossed aside the moment his true nature was exposed. The regional director stormed into the room like a raging tempest. Evan, he barked anger and panic tangled in his voice. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Evan tried to form words, but his throat closed up. "I didn't think." The director slammed his hands on the table, making Evan flinch. "You cost us the biggest contract in the bank's history. You dragged Northwood's name through the mud, and all because of your stupid discriminatory attitude." Each sentence hit Evan like a slap across the face. But he couldn't argue. There was nothing left to defend. No excuse could save him now. More senior leaders poured into the room, each wearing a different expression: anger, disappointment, disbelief. But none of them stood on Evan's side. One threw the contract printout onto the table. "Look at this. Do you have any idea what this was worth?" Then the Deputy Director of Human Resources stepped forward. "Turner, you are immediately suspended. We will be launching a full investigation into your conduct. Until the matter is resolved, you are banned from entering the branch." It took Evan a few seconds to understand that investigation was just a polite term. He knew he had already been condemned. There was no coming back. When he finally stood up, his legs were so weak they nearly buckled, and he had to grip the edge of the table for support. He glanced at Paula, standing silently near the doorway, her eyes filled with regret, but not a shred of defense. And Evan understood why. Paula had seen the truth yesterday. He simply hadn't. He had believed himself too important for consequences to ever touch him. But now he was nothing more than a man in free fall. He slowly grabbed his coat and walked out of the conference room under the stares of dozens of employees lining the hallway. Their whispers followed him step by step. "That's Turner. He lost the contract. Why would he do something like that? Unbelievable." Each whisper stabbed into his spine like a needle. He tried to keep his face composed, but his eyes had become two empty pits. When Evan stepped out of the Northwood building, the morning wind whipped at his coat, but he no longer carried the confident stride or arrogant posture he once had. All that remained was a defeated silhouette, slumped and hollow, like someone who had lost the very thing that once held him upright. While Evan was sinking into the nightmare, he had created an entirely different atmosphere, filled the offices of Bennett Innovations. Claire Bennett walked into the conference room with Harold beside her, and every senior staff member stood at once greeting her with absolute respect. Claire looked around her eyes, still holding the remnants of the fury from the morning, but sharpened now with icy clarity. "New strategy." Claire announced, her voice firm and decisive. "We will transition all processes to Riverstone National. They have sent a revised proposal, better terms, more transparency, and above all, they respect their customers." Marcus Hale, the CFO, stood to present the data cash flow charts, projected interest rates, risk assessments. Every number pointed to Riverstone as the superior choice. Claire allowed herself a small, controlled smile, the quiet kind of victory that did not need applause. Harold watched his daughter and felt something stir in his chest, something almost unfamiliar. Claire was not satisfied simply because she had restored fairness for her father. No, Claire was satisfied because she had corrected a flaw in the world. That was who she was. "You did well," Harold said softly. Claire looked at him, her eyes softening for a brief second. "You deserve to be treated with respect like any other customer. I only did what any decent company should do." Harold said nothing more, but a lightness spread quietly through him. He realized Claire was not just successful. She was strong, and her strength did not come from wealth. It came from principle. Meanwhile, at Northwood's headquarters, another storm exploded. News of the cancelled contract reached the top floor. An emergency meeting was called immediately. The CEO slammed the file onto the table and roared, "Who is Turner? And why has he not been fired yet?" A director stammered, "Sir, we are working on it, but no. But we lost a $5 billion deal. We embarrassed ourselves in front of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, and Northwood is being mocked across social media. Fire him immediately." Evan did not know that within a single hour he had gone from branch talent to enemy of the entire system. And he did not know that the termination message from the CEO was being typed at that very moment, only a few keystrokes away from ending everything. While Evan's world was collapsing, Claire made the final announcement at Bennett Innovations. "Today, we did more than avoid a toxic partner. We sent a message to the entire market. Respecting customers is the foundation of every business." Applause thundered through the room. Harold looked around the bright conference hall and thought perhaps life really does return justice as long as you are patient enough to wait. And somewhere in Seattle, Evan Turner felt the tsunami he had created, finally reaching him, dragging him under deeper and deeper. That afternoon, Seattle was soaked in a thin veil of mist, the high rises fading in and out like silent shadows, watching human lives unfold beneath them. Evan Turner, with his employee badge freshly deactivated and the suspension notice still trembling in his hand, walked slowly out of the Northwood financial parking lot. Everything around him felt coated with a layer of frosted glass. The distant sound of traffic, a stranger talking loudly into a phone across the street, the muffled melody from the cafe nearby, all blending into a shapeless noise Evan could no longer separate. He felt as if he were wading through deep water, each step heavy, dragging an invisible weight behind him. Only hours ago, Evan had believed the whole bank revolved around him, that he was irreplaceable, that the tiny bit of power he held was enough to determine the worth of another human being. Now all he had left was fear, a hollow, chilling fear. He stopped in front of his car, his hands shaking so hard he could not fit the key into the lock. His throat tightened as the image of Harold's ID card hitting the bank's marble floor sliced through his mind. He heard his own mocking voice replaying word for word, each syllable scraping like metal on metal. "A customer like you, trash. Not everyone gets to walk into Northwood." He wanted to scream to silence the memory, but the scream got trapped inside his chest. Evan leaned back against the car door, shutting his eyes, feeling the world tilt with every uneven beat of his heart. For the first time in many years, he was facing something he had never imagined someone like him would ever confront the collapse of himself. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, inside Northwood's offices, the executive team was in an emergency meeting with headquarters. Angry voices, fists slamming on tables, the clattering of spilled coffee, all centered around one name, Evan Turner. A shaken PR staffer read from a summary report. The internal backlash has spread to corporate clients. Several clients are requesting a review of their partnership after hearing about the Bennett Innovations incident. The PR director added, 2 small corporate contracts have already been put on hold this morning. They are asking for a reassessment of Northwood's customer service culture. Northwood's CEO clenched his fists and snarled, "Because of one cheap manager, we lost the biggest contract in 20 years, and now our reputation is collapsing by the hour. Find him. Fire him." and make sure everyone knows this bank does not tolerate that kind of toxicity. Never in his life had Evan Turner been at the center of a storm this massive, not because of achievement, but because of failure. By the end of the day, as the evening fog settled in, Evan received the official email. A single line, but sharper than any blade. "Mr. Turner, your employment with Northwood Financial is hereby terminated, effective immediately." Evan sat frozen in his car for a long time, the glow of the phone screen shining in his face like the spotlight on a prisoner as the final sentence is read. His hands trembled so violently, he dropped the phone to the floor. When he bent down to pick it up, it felt as if he were lifting the last broken piece of his life. He tried calling a few colleagues, the ones he once considered allies, but every call rang out and was declined. No one answered. No one wanted to be associated with the man who had dragged the entire bank into disgrace. Only when darkness had fully taken over the sky did Evan finally leave the parking lot. He drove aimlessly, passing familiar streets he once walked with self-satisfied confidence, streets he had taken every morning in a perfectly pressed suit, believing he mattered, believing he understood how the world worked. But tonight, those streets felt like dark corridors, leading him deeper into the pit of his own truth. When he reached his apartment building, he did not get out. He sat in the quiet car, looking out the window. The Bennett Innovations Tower stood in the distance, shining bright against the night, steady, powerful, proud, everything that his world was not. He murmured, unsure if he was speaking to himself or to the universe. "I just wanted to protect the bank. I was doing the right thing, wasn't I?" But his voice cracked, trembling. Because deep inside, a truth began to open like a bleeding wound. He had not done what was right. He had done what was easy. He had used prejudice as judgment, used his small authority to mask his own insecurity. And when Harold Bennett walked into the bank lobby looking simple and ordinary, Evan had chosen contempt instead of respect. That was not professionalism. That was arrogance. And arrogance had cost him everything. As night settled deeper inside his small apartment, Evan dropped his coat onto a chair and walked slowly to the mirror. The face staring back at him was the same face he had known for 38 years, yet tonight it looked unfamiliar, tired, fractured, empty. He touched the mirror, his voice rough and broken. "What have you done, Evan?" But the mirror gave no answer. It only reflected a man facing a truth bigger than anything he had ever confronted. It was not Harold or Claire who had destroyed his life. He had done it himself. And Harold Bennett, while Evan spiraled into regret, sat in the warm living room of his daughter's home with a cup of hot tea in hand. He stared into the distance for a moment, then smiled softly. Not the smile of someone victorious, but of someone who had been underestimated his entire life, yet managed to keep his heart intact. He whispered to himself, "Justice arrives late, but it arrives." And somewhere in that vast city, Evan Turner finally understood that the arrogance he once embraced had become the scythe that cut down his career forever. The next morning, as the Seattle sunlight reflected off the tall glass towers, Bennett Innovations thrummed with a kind of busy, invigorating energy. The cancellation of the $5 billion contract with Northwood did not shake the company the way many competitors had predicted. In fact, it felt like the opening signal for a wave of transformation strong enough to make the market tremble. In the top-floor executive office, Claire Bennett stood before the large window, arms crossed her gaze, thoughtful yet unwavering. Below her, hundreds of employees, streamed into work, carrying the energy of people who understood they were not serving a company, but a value system, a declaration that human dignity outweighs profit. The door opened, and Marcus Hale, the CFO, stepped inside, holding a stack of freshly printed reports. His voice carried both excitement and professional composure. Clare Riverstone National has sent their final proposal. They accepted every additional condition we requested, including granting us full oversight of customer data security processes. No bank has ever conceded this much. Claire took the documents, skimmed a few lines, then allowed herself a faint smile. "They understand the value of partnering with us," she said. Northwood, on the other hand, underestimated it. Marcus nodded, respect gleaming in his eyes. Within 24 hours of the incident going public, Northwood's stock dropped 12%. They are trying to contain the damage, but the situation looks bad. Claire did not take pleasure in those numbers, yet she felt no regret. That was the nature of business. Every action comes at a cost, and sometimes that cost must be paid by dismantling systems built on arrogance. "Schedule a meeting with Riverstone at 3 this afternoon," Claire said. "We will finalize the new contract this week." Marcus left to prepare, and as the door closed, Harold stepped in as if he had waited for a moment meant only for father and daughter. He wore his light grey wool coat and held the same morning coffee Claire had seen him drink her whole life. "A new day," Harold said gently, his voice filled with layers of thought. Claire turned to him with a rare, genuine smile. "Are you ready for the meeting with Riverstone?" Dad Harold sat down, his eyes drifting toward the growth charts displayed on the screen. "I once thought your company had already reached its peak," he said. "But it seems this is only the beginning." Claire laughed softly. "I think so too." Harold looked at his daughter, the woman he had raised with calloused hands and unspoken lessons. His pride came not from her power, but from the way she held on to her principles while navigating an unforgiving market. "You know," Claire said, standing in that conference room yesterday, "I wasn't just thinking of you. I was thinking of everyone who has ever been dismissed, judged, or had their worth decided because of how they looked." Harold nodded slowly. "All my life, I've met people like Evan more times than you can imagine, and sometimes I thought I had grown used to it. But no. No one should ever get used to disrespect." Claire squeezed his hand gently. "Thanks to you, the world got corrected. Just a little bit." Harold chuckled, a bit embarrassed. "I just did what was right." "So did I," Claire replied. On the other side of Seattle, while Bennett Innovations was rising stronger than ever, Northwood Financial was beginning to crack from the foundation upward. Morning financial news broadcasted. Northwood Financial faces the risk of losing additional corporate clients following the discrimination-related incident. Human resources forums buzzed with the story of Evan Turner's immediate termination, accompanied by dozens of comments from people who had experienced similar issues. Many recalled that Evan had rejected applications simply because clients did not match the bank's image. Stories long buried began to resurface, like fragments of forgotten truth. In Northwood's emergency boardroom, the CEO slammed his hand on the table. "We need a cultural reform program immediately, and someone must get Bennett Innovations back on the phone." "They already declined 3 calls, sir," an assistant whispered. "They will not reconsider." The CEO exhaled sharply. "Because of one fool, we may lose the biggest market share opportunity this year." No one dared respond, because they all knew it was true. Meanwhile, Evan Turner sat in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. He had not slept all night, dark circles sinking under his eyes like the shadow of his downfall. He no longer recognized himself, the man who once walked into the bank every morning, full of self-importance, convinced he had the right to look down on others. Now he was just a hollow figure, sitting in a dim living room, clutching the termination paper like a relic of something that had already died. His phone rang. Evan jolted. Unknown number, but he answered anyway. "Hello." A cold, firm voice on the other end. "We are calling from Northwood's HR department. Your termination process is complete. Please return your uniform access badge and all company property to the branch." Each word struck him like a hammer. Evan nodded, even though they could not see him. "Yes, I'll come in." When the call ended, Evan looked around the living room again, feeling as if the entire place had been drained of air. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, into a world where he no longer held respect, no longer had a voice, no longer had power. He did not know that at that same moment in the headquarters of Bennett Innovations, Claire was signing the new partnership with Riverstone worth $5.3 billion with an extended 10-year expansion clause. A contract larger, stronger, more transparent. As her signature flowed across the final line, the entire room erupted in applause. Harold stood beside her, his eyes glowing with profound pride. "You have taken this company even further," he said. Claire smiled, looking at her father with warmth and resolve. "Not just the company, Dad," she said. "We just set a precedent." Harold gazed at his daughter as if he were looking at the future of an entire generation. And in that moment, he understood that the humiliation Evan Turner had thrown onto the marble floor that day had become the opening bell for the greatest rise of Claire Bennett's life, and the closing bell for a complacent empire called Northwood Financial. On a cold weekend morning, the Seattle sky hung under a blanket of grey clouds that felt like a sigh for the wandering souls below. Harold Bennett stepped into a small corner cafe, the kind he had visited since the days he still owned his construction business. He loved this place, quiet, simple, unpretentious, always filled with the warm scent of freshly roasted coffee. But today, the cafe didn't just bring peace, it brought an ending. The moment Harold walked in, he immediately saw Evan Turner sitting at the table by the window. Evan looked noticeably thinner. His coat wrinkled his eyes, sunken as if he hadn't slept in days. He sat there like a ghost of a man, without a destination, hands clasped together, staring blankly out the window. Harold recognized him instantly, but he didn't turn away. He didn't avoid him. He chose to walk toward him. The soft thuds of Harold's footsteps on the wooden floor made Evan jerk upright. When their eyes met, Evan stood up so fast it looked like he'd been electrocuted. He didn't know what to do with his hands, didn't know whether to greet, apologize, or disappear. Mr. Bennett," Evan stammered, his voice cracking. Harold looked at him, not angry, not triumphant, only calm like a still lake at dawn. "Good morning, Evan." Evan swallowed hard, his eyes reddening. He hadn't expected to see Harold, much less to be greeted with that quiet gentleness. The gentleness of a man who had risen above the hurt, while Evan himself had sunk beneath the weight of his own downfall. "I'm really sorry," Evan managed to say, his voice trembling but sincere. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know." Harold raised a hand gently to stop him. "Evan, that's exactly where you were. Wrong." Evan blinked, confused. Harold sat down across from him. "You didn't need to know who I was." Harold said, his voice low, slow, but piercing. "You only needed to know I was a human being, and for that alone, I deserved respect." Evan lowered his head. His hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I lost my job. No one at Northwood will speak to me. Friends avoid me. I tried applying to other banks, but the moment they hear my name, every door shuts. His voice cracked like fractured glass. Harold watched him for a long moment, and in that moment, he no longer saw the arrogant man from the day before, but someone drowning in the consequences of his own choices. Evan Harold said gently, judging others by their appearance is a dangerous habit. Not just because it hurts someone else, but because it eventually comes back to hurt the one who judges. Evan looked up, his eyes trembling. I know now I was too arrogant. I thought I understood customers. I thought I had the right. The power you thought you had. Harold said finishing the sentence was never yours. It was just a coat the bank lent you, and you mistook it for something you owned. Evan nodded, tears dropping onto the back of his hand. Now, no one trusts me. No one wants to give me a second chance. Harold did not look at him with pity, but with something deeper understanding. Everyone makes mistakes, Evan. But your mistake is not final unless you decide to leave it that way. Evan's voice caught. Do you think I can still fix my life? Harold answered without hesitation, but without sugarcoating. That depends on you. But hear this truth, second chances only come to those who truly change, not to regain a job, but to become a better person. Evan looked into Harold's eyes, and in that moment he understood what made Harold so strong. It wasn't money. It wasn't status. It was dignity. Something Evan had lost long before he lost his job. Harold stood to leave, but before he turned away, he placed a hand on Evan's shoulder, not too long, not too lightly, but with enough weight to convey the final message. What you should fear, Harold said, is not losing your job. It is failing to learn from losing it. Evan bowed his head, his shoulders trembling. Thank you for not hating me. Harold walked away, answering in a calm but powerful tone, I don't need to hate you, Evan. Life has already taught you the lesson I didn't need to. As Harold stepped out of the cafe, the cold morning wind brushed past, carrying the early mist with it. Evan remained in his seat, watching him leave, and for the first time in many years, he truly understood what respect meant, something he once believed was just a procedure, but now realized was the foundation of one's humanity. And in that moment, Evan Turner understood that the greatest lesson of his life had arrived late, but never too late for him to begin again. 1 year after the incident that shook Seattle's financial sector, Bennett Innovations not only maintained its position, but grew 40% thanks to its long-term partnership with Riverstone National Bank. At the year-end conference held at the West Seattle Convention Center, Claire Bennett stepped onto the main stage to the sound of applause from hundreds of employees who looked at their CEO as if they were looking at a symbol of integrity. The stage lights illuminated her face, making her appear both powerful and profoundly human. In the front row, Harold Bennett sat quietly, hands resting on his knees, his eyes filled with pride and peace. When Claire began her speech, she did not talk about revenue growth or massive contracts, the things most CEOs would highlight. Instead, she opened with a sentence that made the entire hall fall silent. All our success this past year comes from a lesson many people consider small, but in truth, it is large enough to destroy an empire respect. Her words echoed across the vast room, reaching even those seated at the very back. Last year, Claire continued a bank employee chose to belittle a customer simply because of his modest appearance. He didn't know who that man was, and he thought it didn't matter. But the only thing he needed to know was that he was a human being. Harold lowered his head with a gentle smile, his heart warming at her words. "My father once told me," Claire said, looking straight at the audience, "that dignity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you hand it to them." The hall grew so quiet you could hear every breath. Claire's voice deepened with conviction. "That is why we choose to build a company that puts people first. Not because it looks good, but because it is right." Thunderous applause exploded again. Harold closed his eyes for a moment as memories of the past year flooded back the decisive meeting, the downfall of Northwood Evan Turner, trembling in a cafe as he apologized. And that moment Claire signed the $5.3 billion Riverstone contract, as if sealing the end of a toxic culture. When the presentation ended, Claire stepped down from the stage and walked toward Harold. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked. Harold placed his hand over hers and squeezed gently, as though pouring thousands of unspoken words into that single gesture. "You did exactly what I spent my whole life teaching you," he said. "You used your power the right way." Meanwhile, the media circulated headlines that drew public attention. Northwood Financial continues losing corporate clients. Cultural reform program shows no improvement. Those reports spread across social media, followed by countless comments from people who had experienced discrimination in financial services. The Bennett-Northwood fallout became a model case in business forums, was discussed in corporate culture seminars, and even used as a case study at 3 major universities in the Pacific Northwest. Northwood became the warning. Bennett became the standard. And in a modest corner of Seattle, Evan Turner was rebuilding his life. He now worked as an insurance agent for a small firm. No more luxury office, no more authority, but he had something he had never possessed before: humility. Every time a customer walked in, Evan stood up, smiled, and said with genuine sincerity, "How may I help you today?" No more judgment, no more arrogance, only the effort to become a better human being. One autumn afternoon, as Evan was tidying his desk, he received an email from a non-profit supporting minority entrepreneurs seeking mentors with financial experience. They asked if he would like to participate. Evan stared at the email so long that his eyes stung, and then he replied, "I would love to," because he now understood that a second chance was not given to restore his career. It was given to restore himself. At the same time, Harold began a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs facing discrimination in the financial system. He sat in the small office Claire had set up for him at Bennett Innovations, surrounded by photos of young entrepreneurs smiling as they held their business plans. "You're changing their lives," Claire said as she stopped by. Harold smiled softly. "Not changing, just giving them what they always deserved: opportunity." The Seattle sunset cast a golden glow across the sky, reflecting against the glass of the Bennett building, where Harold stood looking down at the city. He knew he had lived through many rises and falls, but the moment he picked up that ID card from the bank floor had been the moment that triggered the greatest change. Not just for him, not just for Claire, but for an entire system. A simple truth rose in his mind, like a bell tolling through the quiet evening. Respect is never small. It can save a person. It can ruin an empire. And the greatest legacy of Harold Bennett is that he reminded the world of that truth. From the perspective of a specialist in organizational culture and human behavior, The story of Harold and Claire Bennett reminds us that real power does not lie in billion-dollar contracts or executive seats, but in how a system treats the most vulnerable person who walks through its doors. A single moment of contempt can crumble an entire empire, but one unwavering act of protecting dignity can alter the future of an entire industry. Respect has never been a minor detail, it has always been the foundation, and when that foundation is overlooked, collapse becomes only a matter of time. If you believe stories like this need to be shared to remind us of the value of human dignity and justice, then like this video to support that message, and subscribe so you never miss the journeys that make the world stop and look at itself. Leave a comment with the phrase, "Respect first," to remind one another that every lasting change begins with how we choose to treat a human being.